Why are you right-handed or left-handed? Feels like a question science should have cracked by now. And honestly, we haven't. Not completely. But what we have figured out is genuinely, deeply strange. Because here's the thing, you didn't choose your dominant hand. It was chosen for you. Before you were born. Before you took your very first breath. Around 1 in 10 people on Earth is left-handed. That's roughly 10%. And that number, it hasn't budged in at least 500,000 years. Not a single human population, anywhere on the planet, in any era of history, has ever been mostly left-handed. And no other animal on Earth, not even our closest relatives the chimpanzees, shows the same kind of strong, species-wide hand preference that we do. Doctors can actually predict which hand a baby will favor before they're even born. All they have to do is watch an ultrasound. Whichever hand the fetus moves toward its own mouth, that's the one. And once that pattern locks in, it almost never changes. The 500,000-year figure, that comes from bones. When you use one arm more than the other your whole life, that arm becomes slightly longer, denser, and stronger. When archaeologists dig up ancient human skeletons, roughly 10% of them show the physical signatures of left-handedness, exactly the same ratio we see walking around today. So something very specific is happening inside the human brain. Something that pushes almost all of us toward one side. And that something is ancient. In a cave in Croatia, scientists studied the teeth of a Neanderthal who died around 130,000 years ago. The front teeth had tiny diagonal scratches across them. Here's what happened. This Neanderthal was scraping an animal hide, turning it into clothing. They bit down on one edge to hold it steady. One hand pulled the hide tight. The other hand dragged a sharp stone tool across it. And sometimes, the stone slipped. It nicked the front teeth. The direction of those scratches tells you exactly which hand held the tool. Again and again, across the fossil record, the answer is the right hand. There's even a Homo habilis specimen from nearly 2 million years ago with the same scratch pattern on its teeth. Long before language existed. Before farming. Before any art we've ever discovered, our ancient family was already favoring the right. Cave paintings back this up. On rock walls across Europe, Indonesia, and Argentina, early artists pressed one hand flat against the stone and blew pigment around it to make a stencil outline. The vast majority of those outlined hands are left hands, which means the dominant hand, the one steady enough to hold and aim the pigment tube, was the right. This is not a recent quirk. This is ancient. And it was never really a choice you made. Identical twins, people who share the exact same DNA, can actually have different dominant hands. About 1 in 4 identical twin pairs splits this way. So genetics alone doesn't decide it. But genetics does load the dice. If both your parents are right-handed, you have about a 10% chance of being left-handed, same as the global average. If one parent is left-handed, your odds jump to around 17%. If both parents are left-handed, you're looking at roughly 26%. There's also a small gender gap. Men are slightly more likely to be left-handed than women by a few percentage points, and researchers still aren't sure exactly why. The leading theory right now is that there's no single gene for left-handedness. Instead, there's a cluster of small genetic effects, and one specific tendency that geneticists have nicknamed right shift. Here's how it works. Your brain is cross-wired. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. The right side controls the left. In 99% of right-handers, language lives almost entirely in the left hemisphere, in a region called Broca's area, named after the French scientist who identified it back in the 1860s. That same hemisphere also runs your dominant hand. And there's even a small patch in the left hemisphere, called BA44, that lights up specifically when you make and use tools. Hand control, language, tool use, all clustered on the same side of the brain. That clustering is what the right shift tendency creates. If you carry the shift, your dominant hand and your language both go left hemisphere, which means you end up right-handed. If you don't carry it, the brain doesn't get a clear instruction, and your body essentially picks a side by chance. Left-handedness, then, isn't really a gene for being left-handed. It's the absence of the instruction to be right-handed. Now, why do we favor the right hand and not the left? The answer might go back to something even older than tools. It might come from walking upright. Kangaroos walk on two legs. And as far as we know, they're the only other mammals on Earth that show the same kind of species-wide hand preference we do. Theirs just goes the other direction. Most kangaroos are left-handed, which suggests that standing upright on two legs and freeing the hands from the job of locomotion somehow forces a brain to commit, to pick a side, no matter what species you are. Which raises the obvious question: if right-handedness is the human default, why are there any lefties at all? Why hasn't that 10% been weeded out? The answer comes from baseball. Among the greatest hitters in Major League history, roughly half bat left-handed, from a population where left-handers are only 10%. The same pattern shows up in boxing, fencing, tennis, cricket, and mixed martial arts. A 2019 study analyzed thousands of professional combat sport matches and found that left-handed fighters win significantly more often than their right-handed opponents. Not because they're stronger, because they're rare. When you grow up training against right-handed opponents, your reflexes get calibrated for right-handed attacks. Their punches come from one expected angle. Their stance opens one expected way. Then a lefty steps in, and everything is mirrored. You're off by a fraction of a second. And in a fight, that fraction is the difference between landing a punch and eating one. The logic is elegant. When something is rare, being that rare thing is an advantage. But if it becomes common, the advantage evaporates. That's why the number stays locked around 10%. If too many people were lefties, everyone would be trained against them, and the edge would disappear. If too few existed, the genetic odds would quietly push the number back up. 10% isn't random. It's an evolutionary balance point. But there's a second force at work here. Because a lot of life isn't combat, it's cooperation. Using tools. Sharing equipment. Learning by watching someone else. And tools, going all the way back to the first carved stone, are built for the majority. Scissors. Can openers. School desks. Guitar strings. Even the way cards are dealt in poker. Look at professional golf. Only about 4% of the world's top golfers play left-handed. In golf, you're not facing an opponent. You're alone against the course. The surprise advantage that lefties enjoy in head-to-head competition simply doesn't exist. What does exist is a world of right-handed clubs, right-handed coaching, and right-handed instruction. So here's the pattern. In tasks where you compete directly against another person, being left-handed is an edge. In tasks where you cooperate or use shared tools, it's a disadvantage. The 10% we see today is evolution doing the math across both of those pressures, generation after generation after generation. Now, one more strange thing about left-handed brains. In most people, the two halves of the brain divide work very strictly. Language stays almost entirely on the left. Spatial tasks, picturing things in your mind, recognizing faces, knowing where you are in space, those happen mostly on the right. The two sides rarely overlap. Left-handers are different. The same tasks that stay locked to one hemisphere in right-handers often spread across both hemispheres in left-handers. Researchers have linked this to a few real, measurable effects. When the language center gets damaged, left-handers tend to recover their speech faster, because the other hemisphere can step in and take over. Communication between the two brain halves also runs a bit quicker. And on tasks that require pulling together information from multiple brain regions at once, left-handers perform slightly better on average. The British psychologist Chris McManus, who spent most of his career studying handedness, describes a left-hander's brain as a little more spread out, less strict about which side does what. It's not a superpower. Plenty of lefties are completely average. But across a population, the wiring really is a bit different. Now think about how language has treated this difference throughout history. The Latin word for left is sinister. We still use that word today, to mean evil. Gauche, the French word for left, also means clumsy or socially awkward. In English, your right hand is the skillful one. And being right means being correct. For most of recorded history, left-handed children were forced to switch. Teachers tied their left hands behind their backs. Parents slapped pens out of their hands. Schools across Europe and the Americas treated left-handedness as a defect to be corrected, in some places, well into the 1960s. And it almost never worked. Because the brain had already decided. The brain was not negotiating. You didn't choose your dominant hand the way you chose your favorite color. Your brain picked a side before you took your first breath. And it was following a pattern that has held for 500,000 years. The hand you write with. The hand you wave with. That hand is older than civilization. It is older than language itself. And the small fraction of you reaching with the other one, you're not a mistake. You're the reason the rest of us still have to be ready for a punch we never saw coming.